Hello, to the fifth
Hello.
episode of the Bean podcast. Today, my guest is one of the leading advocates of UBI for the last decades, Dr. Widerquist, Karl Widerquist. And I want to give him an opportunity to introduce himself to us.
Hi. So my name's Karl Widerquist. I'm originally from Cassopolis, Michigan. I'm speaking to you from St. John's, Newfoundland. I'm a professor at Georgetown University's campus in Qatar in the Middle East. I'm a professor of philosophy, but I also have a background in economics, and I specialize mostly in distributive justice, the ethics of who has what. But my interest in basic income leads me to write on lots of topics, including economics, politics, philosophy, and even anthropology and archaeology.
So I would like to ask you first a quick question, because you're like one of the leading advocates and like one of the first advocates. So I would like to ask you, like, when did you hear for the first time about a universal basic income? Like,
Yeah. Well, actually, it was 43 years ago on my 15th birthday, on February 7th, 1980, when I was just turning 15. I watched an episode of Milton Friedman's television show. He had a 10-part documentary series called Free to Choose, which was about his perspective. And one of the episodes, coincidentally, the one that aired on my birthday, was about using a guaranteed income to replace the existing welfare system. And he emphasized that this would be a more efficient system. But I've really come to believe it's not just that it's more efficient, and it's really that it is not the most important thing about it, that this is something that if we have this in place, it will really empower the disadvantaged, especially if we have a large and generous one that we all defend. That was when I was 15. I had to go through high school, college. I didn't start writing about it until the late 1990s, but I've been writing about it ever since. I've been writing about it for about 25 years now.
since you're first, that's a decent time. Since
Yeah,
you're 15,
yeah.
you're like 40 now, right?
I'm 58. I'm 58 now. So 43 years that I've since I first heard about basic income or something like it.
So, out of interest, a quick question. I know that Milton Friedman was one of the people who advocated for universal basic income, but like, do you support the universal basic income in the same type like Milton Friedman supported it? Because if I understand correctly, he wanted like to abolish all other government support. He wanted to abolish, if I can understand correctly, free education and free healthcare. It was a little brutal. Do you support that type of UBI?
No, I don't. And I I don't. He didn't exactly want to get rid of free education. You're not supposed to pay for your education out of this. He had a separate program called the voucher program for education, and I'm not exactly sure what his health policy was, but it was very much government education. No, I do not support the kind of proposal that he wanted. Now, he wasn't necessarily for universal basic income. He was for a negative income tax, which is very similar. And he's of the group that believes that negative income tax and basic income are the same thing, because you can make equivalent plans. A negative income tax is something that ensures everybody gets a minimum of income, but only gives the money to the people whose income is otherwise too low. Whereas basic income assures everybody has a minimum income by giving that money to everybody regardless of what else they get. They're going to tax, but of course they're going to have to tax what other people get, and those taxes are going to counteract the basic income you gave to people. So you can create an equivalence between these, and he thought they were equivalent. So he was actually indifferent between the negative income tax and a UBI. He said that in one of his last interviews, but he was for one that wasn't very generous and one that was going to cut out a lot of other things, including unemployment insurance, old age pensions, food stamps, and also some in-kind services. Some things can be cut out. if somebody's already getting $20,000 a year in Social Security, and we're introducing a $20,000 a year basic income, it's not necessary that we double that person's income. That would be a great windfall for them if we did, but we don't have to. We can cut out, we can make it so, say, if your pension is higher than basic income, you get the pension. If your basic income is higher than the pension, you get the basic income. So you get the higher of the two. And it's not a good idea to cut everything out. His ideas about getting the government out of healthcare and reducing the government's role in education were bad ideas. And his level of negative income tax was just too low. It wasn't generous enough to make sure that everybody had food, shelter, clothing, and the empowerment that comes when a person has their basic needs met and then they enter the labor market because they want to, not because they have to. That is, I think, really key to getting a basic income that's large enough to do that is really key to everything else. I mean, I'll take whatever we can get, but if we got to start with a lower basic income, I would start with that. However, the smaller the basic income, the fewer other programs it can replace. You need a really large basic income if you're going to replace anything at all. There are some things like food stamps that could be replaced by it. The first so many dollars a week of unemployment insurance could be replaced by it. And as I said, but not everything can be replaced by it. And it has to be big and generous. So no, when I was 15, I thought I was a big follower of Milton Friedman. But as I grew up, I realized I'm farther and farther and farther from Milton Friedman, and actually an opponent of a lot of his ideas. A lot of things he's best known for, I strongly oppose.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, for those of our audience who don't know Milton Friedman was an economist, especially in the 80s and 90s. And he was like kind of the inventors of neoliberal economics, if I understand correctly, like for Ronald Reagan and so.
Actually, he was an economist as early as the 1940s. The 90s were the tail end of his career there. Very long, distinguished career. He won the Nobel Prize, and he was one of the architects of neoliberalism. So there's a lot of bad stuff that he can hold her responsible for, but he had some good ideas, and the negative income tax was one of them, and a program. And he did. Largely, he stressed how moving to a negative income tax would benefit taxpayers, as we like, but he was also not uninterested that it empowered the recipients. That if with the conditional programs we have, it gives government bureaucrats a lot of power over individuals, and it gives government rules. Oh, you're eligible if you do this, and you're not eligible if you do that. If you get rid of those rules, that frees the recipient. He was right about that. And he did seem to care about that.
Would you say that the universal basic income is a neoliberal policy?
No, absolutely not. It is. It's a policy. Most people who take a neoliberal approach to it want a small basic income with a big sacrifice in what other programs we're going to have. And if you're just adding a basic income to the existing system, I'll take just about any size basic income. But if they're going to introduce a basic income and say, get rid of everything else, that basic income better be really large. And very often what these neoliberals are doing, a neoliberal proposal would be to sacrifice just about everything else the government's doing to support people's income, and then give you this really ungenerous basic income. That we should not take that. That's a bad deal. We need to get, before we can think about replacing other stuff, we've got to get a good basic income in place.
So you're American. You said you're from Michigan. In your opinion, what would be now in 2023 a good, realistic, universal basic income?
Well, I'm from I grew up in Cassopolis, Michigan. My wife and I now make our home in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I work in Qatar. So have quite a long commute from New Orleans to Qatar. But realistic is a plastic term, because realistic means, what's a realistic basic income? You can mean that in an economic sense. You can mean that in a political sense. And you can mean that in a lot of other senses. Yeah.
I meant especially as a number in the US.
Well, I mean, it's a number, but a number what makes a number realistic? Is this number going to be politically realistic, or is it going to be economically realistic? Because I could say that a basic income of maybe $25,000 a year is economically realistic. We could do that tomorrow if we had the political will. And we could afford it. It's not going to crash the economy. Clearly, the resources are available for people to buy what they're going to buy if we give them a $25,000 basic income. If we have a good tax policy behind that to make the resources available. Now, so I think a $25,000 a year basic income is in the economic sense completely realistic. What is realistic in a political sense is very hard to gauge, because that depends. Well, how big a movement can you build for it? Where's the movement right now? As of the last election, no basic income is realistic in the United States, because the current government isn't going to pass one. But how big we could push for one in the next election and what kind of movement we can build, it's hard to say. There's no limit to that. I would, with an initial proposal, I would say maybe start at about the poverty line. Start at about the poverty line, and which is very low in the United States. The way we measure poverty in the United States is very inadequate. It has been adjusted for inflation, but it's not really been updated and revamped since 1960. It's a very primitive measure. 1960, when they introduced the existing poverty measure. They've tweaked it a little bit, but they've never really reworked it the way other countries have. And so it hasn't kept up with changes in relative prices. In 1960, people spent more on food than they did on rent. And now food has gotten cheaper and cheaper. Rent has gotten more expensive, and it's based on the price of food, our poverty measure. So actually, our poverty measure has gotten to be less and less relative to what you really need to pay your rent and survive. But I would still start with the official poverty line as a good starting point, and then try to build from there. That is probably where we would start in the United States. You could start even lower. One of the things that we're doing as a way of starting lower is to advocate for a child grant. So essentially a basic income only for children, but an unconditional child grant given in cash to everyone. That gets the idea of a basic income on the table, and you can build from there. And it doesn't even have, and as long as you're not canceling any other policies, that's a good addition to the system we have. And it's one that we can build on, and it's clearly building towards the basic income model. But there are disadvantages to starting small and trying to build from there. President Johnson did that in the 1960s when he created Medicare and Medicaid, which were supposed to be steps toward a national health system like they have in Canada and Britain. Well, that's been almost 60 years since he did that, and we haven't really taken the rest of the steps to get towards national health care. We haven't expanded and had Medicare for all, which is really what we need. So these little steps don't always lead to big steps as big as you want. That one, our healthcare step 60 years ago, or almost 60 years ago, was a step in the right direction, but they took it back with a lot of other reforms that happened since, allowing a lot more for-profit firms into the healthcare industry, which Nixon did, and really took back a lot of the reforms that we got under Johnson, or made them work less well. So a child credit is a good way to start, but we got to have a movement to build from there. That's going to be our next step. We got to build from there.
Didn't Nixon want to implement a UBI in the USA?
Well, yes and no. He proposed something called the Family Assistance Plan, the FAP. And the FAP never got passed. And so it passed, it failed narrowly. It passed the House of Representatives twice, but was defeated in the Senate by fairly narrow votes. So we almost got this version of the negative income tax. And so people go down and say, well, Nixon's good deed, that Nixon almost got us a negative income tax, but it wasn't a negative income tax. It was for working families. It was not for everybody. It wasn't universal the way a true negative income tax was. It wasn't large enough, but yet they were trying to replace other things with it. So there were a lot of problems with the FAP proposal, and a lot of those problems made it very different from the negative income tax and even farther from the basic income. So we were getting close. It was a step in that direction, but it's a smaller step in that direction than people who look back in that era tend to portray it. They portray it as this, oh, we almost got negative income tax. Well, we almost got this thing that was kind of a step towards negative income tax.
So did they have in the Senate, like as Joe mentioned, also then, or why did it fail?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch what you just said.
Did they have, like a Joe mentioned, in the U.S. Senate also then? Or why did it fail in the Senate?
Oh, it actually, well, back then the parties weren't so polarized on this side. So most bills that came up back then would get some Republican votes and some Democratic votes and some Republican opposition and some Democratic opposition. It was really weird how things would be sort. Now there's always like Democrat proposals, all the Democrats and a couple Republicans for it, and there's a Republican proposal, all the Republicans and a couple Democrats for it. It wasn't like that back then. So you're piecing together a lot of votes. And one theory about Nixon's family assistance plan is that Nixon didn't really want it to pass. He wanted it to fail, but he wanted to be able to blame the Democrats for it failing. And to some extent, he successfully did. If that's what he was trying to do, to some extent, he successfully did that. And it was also weird. It was one of those proposals where they try to find the center ground. They try to find the center ground, and they end up falling into a central ditch. Because what they found was, as they moved toward this compromise between what the conservatives would support and what the liberals would support, they got a program that the real liberals opposed because it was too small and had too many conditions. And the hardline conservatives opposed because it was too big and didn't have enough conditions. So it got opposition from both sides, and it had really strong support from no one. The people who were out there on the streets advocating for improving the welfare system, which a lot of people were, including Martin Luther King, and after he died, a lot of his followers, and the Poor People's Campaign and other groups, they weren't excited about the FAP because it wasn't large enough and it had too many conditions. So it really failed to build a constituency. Even though it almost passed, there was very little cost when the Senate voted against it. They didn't really pay a cost with their voters for voting against it.
I guess we can say that the political landscape changed in the USA since then.
Oh yeah, it's changed a great deal since then. It was starting to change. It was starting to change in the direction a bunch of things happened, probably beginning with the 1964 election. You could trace it even back further to Nixon's ascendancy, the vice presidency. But a lot of things changed really in the 1960s that caused these things. Well, gradually, Southern conservative Democrats began moving to the Republican Party in about 1964. And blacks, at about the same time, maybe even a little bit earlier, Black Americans started moving to the Democratic Party. And as this happened, the parties gradually became more polarized. You begin to see this in the 60s. And then you see it gradually more and more by the 1980s. And by the 1980s, the Republicans are clearly the conservative policy. The Democrats are clearly the liberal party. And the South is rapidly becoming from a solid Democratic place to a solid Republican place as conservative Democrats become conservative Republicans. And then the polarization has just continued since the 1980s on a lot of other issues. So yeah, it's just an extremely different political environment than it was in those days.
So now in 2023, which party do you think is more realistically to support like a universal basic income? A Republican Trump party that also is like, because that Trump is different than the other Republicans. The classic Republicans are more of like the rich people class, but Trump is rather a Republican who also speaks to poor people, like in the Rust Belt states, for example. Or is it more the Democrats who are also pro reparations and similar policies?
Yeah, no, I don't see the Republicans creating any major new social programs anytime soon, or any even minor new social programs. They're about vilifying immigrants, vilifying Black people, and in the name of supposed equality of the races, they just want to take away any help we've given to Black people to try to help them become equal. So they're moving towards inequality in the name of color blindness and equality. And that's what they're giving, and they're giving to their constituents. You're better than these people that we're vilifying. You're better. That the real danger to you is not that you're poor. The real danger to you is immigrants, or it's the ideology that we need to change in order for Blacks to be equal. That Blacks weren't automatically equal 60 years ago when we had some minor legislation trying to redress some of the problems with our racist society. They're into doing these things and to doing these religious things, outlawing abortion and having prayer in schools and things like that. Republicans are doing these things, so I don't see them really getting on board with any initiative to actually help their constituents, even though there are a lot of poor whites who are constituents of the Republican Party who would greatly benefit from this. That leaves, and sadly in the United States, where there are only two realistic parties, that leaves the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party has a history of being a middle-of-the-road, very compromising party that doesn't do a lot of bold things. There have been some big exceptions to that. The New Deal under Roosevelt, to some extent, the Great Society under Johnson, which got derailed by that awful idea he had of going to war in Vietnam. But he did some good things on the domestic. He did a lot of good things on the domestic front, actually. But so you might get a bold Democratic leader who would do some of these. However, what people want to blame everything bad about the Democratic Party on the Democratic leadership. But actually, what we need to think is about progressive Americans. What have we failed to do in our strategy? And conservative Republicans, the most radical conservative Republicans, have done an excellent strategic job of getting their ideas to the forefront of the Republican Party and taking it over. The Republican Party used to have a middle-of-the-road leadership like the elder George Bush, Bob Dole, Nelson Rockefeller, Gerald Ford. These were very middle-of-the-road people, even some of them kind of liberal. The Republican Party, the conservative element, through a bunch of different strategies, have taken over that party by running candidates in the primaries who are able to say, if you're not very, very conservative, then you're not a real Republican. People aren't really doing that on the Democratic side. People who are very progressive need to take over and fight in those programs and take those, be ready to dismiss those middle-of-the-road Democrats, and move the party to a more progressive position. They think, well, if you do that, you lose elections. Well, the Republicans have been doing that, and they've lost some elections, but they've also won some elections. And when they win elections, they get the things they want. If you run these middle-of-the-road candidates, you win some elections, but you never get what you want. You win some, you lose some, and you never get what you want. The Republicans running these more radical candidates, at least when they win elections, they get what they want.
But like, I mean, it's the kind of sad thing. I just watched some days ago an interview with like an economist, his name like Adam Tooze or so, and or an historian, and he was talking about like, let's talk about a very Republican state, West Virginia, He says it
Yeah.
has life expectancy lower than, not lower, as similar to North Korea. So when
Yeah.
we're talking about like the Republican states, I guess those are the states that require most like social
Yeah.
programs and like poverty relief programs. It's kind of weird that those rather poorer states like West Virginia, I guess also Alabama, Mississippi
Yeah.
are the richest states, vote that red and would be like the barrier
Yeah.
in the way to a universal basic income, like because
Yeah.
those should be the strongest advocates. Those should be like
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
progressive advocates who push for UBI. So, what do you think? What is the reason for that?
Sorry, what is the reason why progressives aren't pushing for UBI?
No, what is the reason that those red states that would benefit
Oh,
probably most from a UBI are the most conservative, also economically, and vote for the candidates who oppose more like
okay, I
economic
see.
policies?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of reasons. But in America, white people don't usually think about racism. And that's their mistake, because we have this racist background in our society. And if you're not looking at the effects on this, if you're not looking at the effects of this, then you're not going to understand how politics is working. What it's doing is that a lot of the things that progressives are proposing, a lot of low income white people would benefit from. But the Republicans have been very good job to say to those low income white people, those things are for black people. Those things are for Latino or Latino or people of Spanish speaking heritage or Native Americans or for immigrants. They're not for you. And that those groups are trying to get what you have. And rather than those groups are not at all opposed to the interests of white working class people. But as long as you can keep a significant number of white working class people more afraid of non-white people of all stripes, as long as you can keep them that they're mostly running on this fear of non-white people or whatever other group they want to vilify. Maybe it's non-Christians, maybe it's LGBTQ people, whoever they're vilifying this week. If you can keep them more afraid of these groups, then looking at reforms, what's a reform that's going to help all of the disadvantaged people of all races, you create this animosity, and that animosity is a very effective way to block progressive change. And this is something I wish I could do. We need someone who can really sell that idea to low-income white people, that their natural allies are of all races. That the things that black people have been advocating for 100 years would greatly benefit low-income white people, and we haven't really done a good job of making that case.
But like, what do you think would be like the best way to do that? Wouldn't a Democrat like Biden, who, like, to be honest, I think Biden has a lot of very progressive policies he's trying to implement. So shouldn't a Democrat like Biden, who has a rather conservative mentality probably, but is on the economic front rather progressive, shouldn't he be the right person to do that?
Well, he could be if he's bold enough. Hillary Clinton, when she lost in 2016, said, "I wish I'd gone for broke and advocated a basic income."
Really?
Well, yeah, she really said that. She really said that after she lost the election. Well, why don't you try that? We've had so few really bold leaders on the progressive side, in the United States. They're really Roosevelt, Johnson. Maybe you can go back to the earlier Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, 120 years ago. And they really did some things that really benefited people. And there's lots of reasons why they succeeded and failed and stuff like that. A bold leader could do that. A bold leader could do that, but what is needed is a lot of grassroots progressivism. I do not know how to build grassroots progressivism. I'm a theorist. I write about what I think should work and why. I write about why we should think this is just. Is it a sustainable policy? I write on these things. I hope that my work and my advocacy are useful to the people who know how to build constituencies and make this kind of and change politics. I hope my work is useful to them, and I will back them up in any way I can if they ask me to speak or do something. But knowing how to strategize in that field, once you get to knowing what is the best way to strategize to get this message out, I have to defer to the activists on that.
So instead of continuing talking about activism, there is a U.S. state with universal basic income, actually, if I understand right. And it's a red state, surprisingly.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, it is. Yeah. Go on.
So, yeah, what can you tell us about the universal, or the universal basic income type program in Alaska? Do you think it was successful? Yeah. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I think it's extremely successful. It's a great program. Michael Howard and I edited 2 books on that. It's called the Alaska Dividend for short. It's actually a combination of 2 programs. One is the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is what they do is they take some of their oil revenues, they put it in an investment portfolio, and that investment portfolio was called the Alaska Permanent Fund. They created that in 1975 or 6. I think it's 76 when they first started putting money in. I think it might have. They created that in 1976. They've been put money into it. They put money into it. Was it 74, 5 or anyway around then, mid 70s? But it wasn't until they didn't know what they were going to do with that fund. But it was by 1982, in the last year of Jay Hammond's term of office. Jay Hammond was a Republican governor back when there were a lot of liberal Republicans, and he was a liberal Republican. Jay Hammond used the power of his office to push this through, that what we're going to use this APF for is to fund the PFD, the Permanent Fund Dividend, which goes out to all legal residents of Alaska who fill out forms verifying it. So it's almost unconditional. It is the only thing that's conditional is you've got to fill out forms to verify that you are still a resident. And that's harder than you think, because the form has all these, when did you move here? How long are you staying? How long were you gone this year? Were you gone more than 3 months? And if you were gone more than 3 months, was it because you were on our Olympic team? Was it because you were in the military? Something like that. Were you gone on state business? So it's really complicated. So there are people who don't get it because filling out the form is so difficult. That's really what separates it from being universal. And in other ways, it fits the 5 criteria of Bien's definition. Other than that form you got to fill out, it is otherwise unconditional. You don't have to do anything to get it. It is individual. It goes to every man, woman, and child. It doesn't just go to the head of the household. And on an individual basis, everybody gets the same amount, regardless of whether you're married or single, whether you're a child, an adult. Everybody gets the same amount. It's an individual basis. It is not conditional on. It's not conditional on any behavioral characteristic. Not conditional on whether you work or whether you don't work. It's not conditional on need. You don't have to prove that you need it. You don't have to prove that you're willing to work. And it is. Let's see. Unconditional. Which ones have I mentioned? But anyway, so it meets, and it is a regular payment. It's once a year, and it's regular in the sense that you're going to get a payment every year. But it's irregular in the sense you don't know how large the payment is going to be. So it's a little bit unpredictable because it goes up and down with the returns to the investment fund. So in that sense, it's not regular. So it's regular in one sense and not in another, and it's universal in one sense, but not in the sense that you got to fill out this form. It's unconditional in all senses except you have to fill out these forms. It's very close to a basic income. It is small. It's not large enough to live on. It's not as large as most basic income supporters would like to see, but they didn't cancel a single other program. They did not cancel a single other program when they put, so it's an add-on to everything else. It unequivocally makes Alaskans better off. If you're a low-income Alaskan and every member of your family gets a check for $2,000, some years it's $1,500, some years it's even more than that, more than $2,000. You get that check. Say you live in a family of 5 and you get $2,000 each. That's $10,000 to somebody living in a margin. That's a big difference. And yes, it has proved great for Alaska. It's proved to be a very popular program. It has helped Alaska become one of the more equal states in the union. And it's been correlated with economic growth. It's really been a very good program. Yet there are politicians who want that money. They want to divert that money to something else. So it is under threat. And the weaker the rest of the Alaskan budget gets as oil revenues decline, the more under threat it's going to be. So it's going to take a lot to defend this policy. But it's a very good, and it's really an example to the world of how to move in the direction of basic income.
All right. So we just talked about Alaska. I just want to ask you, because for the children, who takes the money? Like the father or the mother, or is it given directly to the children in Alaska?
No, they don't give it directly to the children. It goes to the custodial parent, whatever parent is taking care of the children. Of course, but it is in the name of the child. And so the money is for the child's benefit. Now, it is up, like anything else, it's up to a parent to decide how it's done, what's best for this child. That's the parent's job, and most parents do that job adequately. And the ones who don't, well, maybe they need some supervision, but that's very few parents. So the parents take it, and the parents take a number of different strategies. A lot of well-to-do families, and well-to-do, not necessarily rich, but people who are, say, in the top 20, 30, 40% of the income distribution, a lot of, upper middle class people, a lot of these people will take their money, their kids' money, they'll take the kids' permanent fund dividend, they will put it in the bank and not let the kid touch it till the kid turns 18 or 21. So if your parents have been doing that, if your parents can afford to do that, you turn 21 and you've got 21 years of permanent fund dividend that's been accumulating in the bank. That gives you a really head start to start your life, So some people do that, but other people do a lot of things. Like a lot of things people will buy a car, or they will buy like the big ticket items that they need, or they'll buy in Alaska. In Alaska, you need good winter clothing. So a lot of times, they'll get and you get the Alaska dividend in the fall. So they'll go out, you got a family, you go out and buy a good winter coats for everybody. That takes a significant chunk of your thing, but you got the money to do it all of a sudden. Sometimes you need car repairs, sometimes you need so people use it for various expenses, whatever expense they have, or for those items that they've been saving up for, and in the United States, there's no real dental insurance in the United States. So a lot of times you get this and one of your kids needs oral surgery, another one needs braces, and you're spending this on teeth for your kids.
Then actually the indigenous people of Alaska get the same like payments from the beginning?
Oh, actually, well, that's mandated by the Constitution. One of the best amendments, one of the best rules in the United States, equal protection of the law, the 14th Amendment, not always well enforced. And sometimes enforced in the wrong way, where they want to give corporations equal protection of the law. Well, corporations aren't people. That's actually giving the people that own those corporations more than equal if you give them special rights for corporations. But so it's been misused, but it's very good. You cannot just shut out Native Americans from getting it. So Native Americans get this. Now, people, that's the problem with when I say there's a background of racism in the U.S. What people will then do is they will write programs. They will write programs in such a way that it will effectively exclude people without a rule that says I exclude you. So if we do it like this, a lot of black people or a lot of Native Americans are going to be eligible. But if we tweak this rule, like they did this with the minimum wage in the U.S. The minimum wage exempts domestic workers and farm workers. Well, what do domestic workers and farm workers have in common? They tend to be black and Latino. And who do they work for? They work for large agricultural firms, and they work for the richest people. I mean, who's rich enough? Well, in the United States, who's rich enough to have domestic servants? Well, the richest people in the U.S. So they benefit, and the richest people tend to be very white. The small family farmer doesn't hire a lot of agricultural workers. It's the big agribusiness people who hire the agricultural workers. And so they effectively find ways to exclude Black and Hispanic and other people from programs. You got to look out for things like that. But they haven't done that. They have not done that, and they haven't with Alaska's permanent fund dividend. And they've also had something better for a lot of Native communities in Alaska, because some of the tribes, the oil is under their land. So they get extra for the fact that the oil is under their land. So some of them are getting dividends. They're getting the Alaska dividend plus the tribal dividend on top of that for the fact that the oil is specifically on their tribe's land. So some Native Americans are doing very well. Some Native Alaskans are doing very well because of this. And they're getting very good dividends. There's been some studies of there's a lot of tribal dividends now for one reason or another. Some tribes have them, some don't. Some can afford them, some cannot. Some could afford them but choose to use the money for something else. Some simply can't afford them, and some use it for dividends. People talk about the Cherokee dividend, but the Cherokee is a tribe in the southeastern United States. But there's actually a lot of dividends in Alaska by the Alaskan Native tribes, but they tend not to talk about it. Sometimes the tribes want this to be studied. We're hearing a lot about the Cherokee dividend because the Cherokees want this program to be studied. But others are like, well, we don't want to make the poor tribes jealous by focusing on that, so we just don't talk about it a lot. And they got to do what protects them. But sooner or later, people are going to study these tribal dividends, and I think it's going to provide really excellent evidence for how a stream of income can take a less privileged group of people and really help them in substantive ways that help them move up and move up in our system.
Maybe they also don't want politicians to hear about it to start to take it away.
Yeah, to take away other stuff. Yeah.
Well, actually, I know that in the USA, the businesses have some also political power. There is a lot of lobbying, right? So,
yeah. You know American politics very well. This is another very big problem in the United States is that we basically legalized bribery. We have legalized bribery in the United States. The people giving the bribes don't think of it as a bribe. The people taking the bribe don't think of it as a bribe, and it's just bribery. We call it a campaign contribution when it's really nothing but a bribe. Most members of Congress spend the vast majority of their time raising money. They raise money by going to wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals and asking for big chunks of money for their campaign. And by doing that, that means they've got to give them something. It is the only thing, what is illegal is to say a quid pro quo. If you give me $100,000, I'll vote for this. They can't say that, but they can say, look, these are all these things you're for. I'm for these things too. You can give me money in general because I'm for all these things. I can't say anything specific on a particular piece of legislation, but I'm for all these things. So we find that both parties are largely controlled by their various donors. And this is a bigger problem for progressives than it is for conservatives, because a lot of things conservatives want, the big donors aren't against. The big donors don't care if you want guns, okay. Big donors are happy to have you guns. You want some racist legislation to keep out immigrants, okay. The big donors don't care about that. But a lot of things that progressives want, which is less favors given out by the government to corporations and more taxes on corporations and greater help for the poor to make them free to demand higher wages. Well, a lot of those things are things that the donor class is going to oppose. So one of the things that progressives need to do is to get the money out of politics. To have real democracy in the United States, we need to get the money out. People say we're a democracy because we have elections. Well, that's not all there is to it. Yeah, we have elections where only individuals vote, but when you see the outcome of those elections is only among candidates that have been made viable by their money. You're not a viable candidate unless you raise a bunch of money. That means the first duty of that candidate is to support the people who can give them money. So we have, and you can see that in legislation. If the majority of people are for something, that is fairly even correlated with whether we get that thing. But if the majority of rich people are for something, then we usually get that thing. We got same-sex marriage, not when the majority of Americans wanted same-sex marriage. We got it when a majority of the donor class wanted same-sex marriage. Well, good for the donor class on this one, but they shouldn't be controlling the government. It should be what the people want. And that is, I think, a step to getting basic income. I started working on basic income because I thought it was the biggest problem we have. But now I see there are a lot of other problems that are just as big as poverty and inequality in America. We have legalized bribery in the name of campaign contributions. We have a very militaristic stance by the government, and we're killing the environment that sustains us. All three of those are just as big a problems, and some of those problems, just as big as problems as the poverty and inequality that I've been addressing my whole career. A lot of these are just as big a problem or bigger, and some of these, at least the one about the fact that we're not a true democracy, is one of the essential barriers to getting a basic income. So I know there are other people that are working on that issue as hard as I'm working on basic income. I specialize in this and they specialize in that, and they've got to succeed for me to succeed.
So, but I agree with you 100% that corruption is really, really bad and lobbyism is really, really bad normally. Yeah. But in the case of universal basic income, a lot of the really, really rich guys from Silicon Valley, from California, support universal basic income. So couldn't that really bad thing in that case opens the door for universal basic income?
Yeah, it might. Yeah, if enough Silicon Valley billionaires get behind basic income and really push for it, we will get basic income. That's how things work in the U.S. You get a bunch of rich people behind you. That's why Obamacare was such a tiny step forward. It's towards universalism, is because he wanted to have some form of Barack Obama wanted to have some form of universal health care. He says, how do I get it through in the political realities of the environment today? He says, well, you gotta get the insurance companies on your side. So let's work in a bunch of goodies for the insurance company for it, to get the insurance companies on their side, and the insurance companies backed it. And you got to get the for-profit hospital chain on your side, and the for-profit private practice doctors who are in plastic surgery or whatever, and whatever things they want. And you've got to get the drug manufacturers by. So you get this thing that's a little step forward for the people and a huge step forward for health insurers, for drug manufacturers, for for-profit hospitals, and for for-profit large-scale doctors. So you get this program that is largely derailed by that. Now, so if we get a basic income that is driven by what Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and the original Twitter guy, what's his name, that used to run Twitter, all of these people have at least said something good about basic income. If you get the kind of basic income that they want, we will get something. But those people don't necessarily have the best model of basic income in mind. Usually their ideas are much less generous. Chris Hughes, one of the co-founders of Facebook, I've met him. He's a good guy. His heart's in the right place. But he has this idea that anything larger than $500 a month is not realistic. And $500 a month is not going to be life-changing. It's not the kind of real reform we need. It's a small start, and it's a kind of a defeatist small start. So no, it could happen with the pressure of the Silicon Valley billionaires, but I'm not counting on them to come to our rescue, and I'm not counting on them to craft what we really most need.
You don't trust in Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg to rescue democracy?
Yeah, well, it's not just about trust. It's also about what they're on the record is for. I actually trust Chris Hughes. I think Chris Hughes is a good guy, but I think his program lacks ambition, and it lacks ambition because of his perspective. He needs a wider perspective. Whereas the others, like, I think Zuckerberg and Chris Hughes are friends. To the extent that Zuckerberg is even talking about this, I would guess that that's because Chris Hughes asked him to. I don't think Zuckerberg is really enthusiastic about this. And Elon Musk has 100 ideas an hour, and 3 of them are good ideas. Half of them are indifferent, and the rest are bad ideas. And he doesn't always know which one of his ideas are good ideas, but most of his ideas he just drops. So he said something about basic income. He's not doing any work for basic income. He said something. He was going to bore tunnels. He was going to bore tunnels under our cities to have pneumonic trains powered like pneumonic tubes to have intercity travel. He never did that. He's not anywhere on doing it. He talks about crap ideas off the top of his head, and then he goes and buys Twitter and spends all his time taking what was a decent platform and making it slightly worse and losing money in the process. So no, Elon Musk is not gonna get us our basic income, even though he's got the political power that if he really wanted to do it, he could put a lot of power into doing it.
I'd say that Elon Musk's investment in Twitter was a great step from him towards the redistribution and more equal world.
Yeah. What it's really good for is the people who used to run Twitter. They all got this enormous payday at these overinflated prices for it, and they can go off and retire. So they start this platform that has a lot of good aspects to it. I use Twitter. I'd like to find an alternative to it, but I've got thousands of followers on Twitter, and building up from some other platform and picking which platform is going to work. So at the moment, I'm still on Twitter, but I am, like a lot of Twitter people, I'm looking for something better. But yeah, he buys that. But the people who started Twitter, good payday for them. Maybe one of them still has some of the conscience that they brought with them when they were young and starting out. Maybe one of them will do some good with the power they've got from all these billions of dollars.
So you said in the beginning that you saw that from an economic perspective, we have been now a lot in the political. So you said from an economic perspective, it would be realistic to have a UBI in the USA of 20,000 USD a year.
Absolutely.
How could that be financed?
Well, Well, when you finance something, you got to remember it's not about for every dollar you spend, you got to raise a dollar in taxes or borrow a dollar worth of money. It doesn't really work like that. It's just far more complex. Whenever you spend money, that creates inflationary pressure because people are going out to buy goods. And if the goods are available, if there's unemployed workers and empty factories ready to make those goods, then you can spend money without increasing taxes at all. But basic income's a lot of money, and it's going to everybody. You've got to claw some of that money back. So you spend money, creates inflationary pressure. You tax money, creates deflationary pressure. And the trick is to balance these two. People think if you have a balanced budget, that's what's going to balance those two. Well, no, it's not that simple. Very often you can run a deficit. Very often you need to run a deficit. If you actually balance the budget or even borrow too much money, you create too much deflationary pressure, and that will creates too much deflationary pressure, and that will cause a recession or slow down the economy. So you don't necessarily need a one-to-one balance of taxes and spending, but you do need to have some taxes. You've got, but there's lots of things you can tax. A lot of the inflationary pressure that we have right now is because of inequality. Mm-hmm. We've given so many government giveaways to the rich by, oh, they want this, well, the government will buy it. Oh, they want that, the government will buy from the rich people. We give them so many goodies. The Federal Reserve is just a great way for the government to just funnel money to the people who already own the banks and are the richest people in the country. And it's run, a government program is run by billionaires. The Federal Reserve is all either billionaires or centimillionaires. And they set government policy. It's so incredibly undemocratic. So the government is doing all these things to funnel money to them. The government can stop funneling money to the rich. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, when you funnel all that money to the rich and then don't tax them, the rich have a bunch of money they don't know what to do with. So what do they do with it? Well, one of the things they do with it is they buy real estate. They buy it bulk, so you get more and more people who have a dozen houses and they're not using any of those houses more than more than a month a year. You know, do the math. The average house, you own 12 houses. The average, if you never go on a vacation, if you're always in one of your own houses, never at a hotel, you're not using any house more than a month a year, 11 months sitting empty. We have gutted cities. We have cities where the highest rental value neighborhoods are empty most of the time because the people that own those places are gone 11 months of the year. But also they don't, and that pushes up real estate prices and makes everything in the city more expensive. Well, that's the kind of inflationary stuff that you need to address with tax. You tax this group of people, you tax land ownership, you help to reverse that. But another thing they do is they don't just buy consumption housing, they also buy buildings and rent them out. And they're buying buildings expecting that if I buy this building, it's going to go up in value in the future. So they're all buying these buildings. That pushes up the purchase price and the rental price, which squeezes everybody who lives or rents, who lives in a city, who rents either an apartment or business space in the city. All of their prices are going up. That's inflationary. That's the kind of thing we need to counteract with taxes. You tax the very wealthy, and you tax land ownership, resource ownership. You tax, you take back the giveaways that we're giving to banks by taxing the services that we're providing for them through the Federal Reserve for free, the insurance services we're giving them, the free money whenever they want it at super low interest rates. You make them pay for that. You do these things, and yes, you can finance a basic income of quite a bit more than this. Anything at least 60% of median income, we could have a basic income, perhaps even more than that. Depends on the system.
So only because I know that opponents of UBI would then say they want to do UBI, they want to tax your houses, would we then tax all land ownership, all house ownership, or would it start like at the fifth house or at the third house or something like that?
Well, you tax people think that the amount you pay is going to go up if there's land taxes, and that's generally not that. For most people, that is not true. Your landlord, if you rent property, your landlord is getting a huge windfall because they own this really valuable land. You tax the land value, you distribute from the landlord to the government, and you give the landlord less of a reason to keep bidding up the price of land. Actually, the rental price of that can actually go down. A tax on land can actually reduce the price of land because it makes it less attractive for speculators to keep buying and buying and buying, hoping that the price is going to keep going up. They can't afford to just buy land, sit there and hold it because there's taxes on it. So they're only going to buy it if they really can rent it out to people. So it's between them. A good strategic tax, which we don't have because the donor class doesn't want it, but a good strategic tax can target the wealthy with things like a land tax, like a wealth tax, like the Federal Reserve taking out all the goodies that it's giving to the bankers. These kinds of things can reduce prices at the prices to low-income people at the same time that they create this big, at the same time that they attack the inequality that we have today.
So let's talk with the Bernie Sanders language. Which percentage of the Americans would like, because in such a model, a UBI would be a measure of redistribution. So in such a model, what from the income percentages or from the wealth percentages, what percentage of the Americans would be benefiting? Would be better off? What percentage of the American would be worse off directly? And what percentage of the Americans would be like neutrally affected by such a model?
I wrote a paper with I wrote two articles that are relevant to this. One, estimating the cost of a basic income in the United States, and another one, estimating the cost of basic income in the United Kingdom. And in the United States, a low basic income, which was using 2015 dollars, and we've had some inflation since then. So so the equivalent numbers would be all of this, times how much prices have gone up since then. But a roughly poverty line basic income of $12,000 with a 50% marginal tax rate would benefit. I think the number was, I have to look this up in the paper. The paper is called Cost of Basic Income in the United States, back of the envelope calculations. You can look it up online. That would benefit, I think it was 47% of Americans. And the benefit would kind of peter out as you get to that 47% mark. But it doesn't, if the taxes that you use to finance it, we didn't really look at what taxes you'd use to counteract the inflationary effects of this. If those are taken mostly from the top 1%, that doesn't mean that it's any significant harm or harm at all to the people between the 47th percentile and the 70th or 80th percentile. Doesn't need to be much of a cost to them. Now, but that was for 12,000 with 50% one. If you lower the marginal tax rate from 50% to 30%, then far more people benefit from it. Or if you retain the 50% tax rate and go to a $20,000 a year basic income, that ends up being a direct financial benefit to nearly 70% of American households. And yes, the top 1% we can tax them enough to make sure that this program that benefits 70% of Americans is non-inflationary. It's easy to see that when you look at our economy has doubled in size in the last 40 years. and almost all of those benefits have gone to the top 1%. So it's very clear. It's very clear they have the money. If we'd have stayed on the trajectory where we're at in the early 1970s, with people sharing the benefits of it, the upper class would not have all this money to begin with. So yes, they can certainly afford to pay this money and make sure that this basic income is not going to be inflationary.
So to make it more obvious for our audience, when you are in the 1%, like the poorest person in the top 1% in the USA, how much money do they have so on average? Are they like a millionaire, a billionaire? Like how much money?
I think that comes out. I think it's something in the neighborhood of $400,000 or $500,000 a year in income. That gets you to the very bottom of the 1%. But there is more inequality within the top 1% than there is in the rest of the 99%. That person at the bottom of the 1% is they're like they're not even the size of an ant compared to Elon Musk, the person at the very top, or Warren Buffett, or one of the others at the very top. There's a huge differential in them, and we need, and we can get it if we get money out of politics. We need things that primarily target the top 1% of the 1%, the top 110,000. And we've been giving them so many goodies for so long. It's time to take some of that back and say, actually, we never should have given you all these giveaways. We've got to have a system that rewards everybody, not just those at the very top. And we can do that economically. It's not difficult to do that. It's about getting the money out of politics and taking that political power and using it for good.
But would that even be possible? I mean, like most of those rich guys don't even pay any taxes. They just like, they have their race. They open like, I don't know, a headquarters in Panama and Ireland.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
so,
those loopholes exist because we created them. We've created them because the donor class wants them. And some of the best tax shelters aren't even in Panama anymore. They're in North Dakota. North Dakota has created all these laws where you create your trust there and you basically pay very close to zero. Or is it South Dakota? I don't know, maybe it's one of the Dakotas. It might be South Dakota. But anyway, you create your trust there. You don't even have to go there. You just create your trust there, have it run under North Dakota law, and you can shelter it from all kinds of taxes. Then you could go to Panama. You can do this. We created the laws that made this possible. We can change the laws that made this possible. Which we need a truly democratic government that is responsive to the wants of the people and not to the wants of corporations. And you find the most open, the most democratic governments where the people as a whole have the most power over their government also tend to have the most progressive policies. Finland, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, all in that position, all very democratic and all very equal, with a very high tax burden on corporations and very few giveaways given to corporations.
So there is a much more I'd like to talk with you about.
Yeah.
Especially I would love to talk with you about the Middle East, the potential for UBI in those Gulf states, about the philosophy of it more. But I think we're now above 1 hour.
I think today turned out to be our U.S. policy. The topic for today, in retrospect, was basic income in U.S. politics. So why don't we do this again in a few months and think about a different subtopic to look at, basic income and something else other than U.S. politics, and we'll talk about that in a few months.
Perfect. One last question asked in the last 2 episodes. If you would compare universal basic income with, or like if you would describe it, or which song would you choose to describe universal basic income? If you would choose a song for universal basic income to describe it, or that stands for it, or symbolizes it, which song would you choose?
Okay, well, actually, there's a Danish band that actually has a hardcore song called "The Power to Say No," which the band is called Borgerlon. I don't speak Danish, but one line in the song, which they say over and over again, is in English. That's the power to say no. The rest is in Danish. So unless you speak both Danish and English, you can't understand the song. But that's a good one. Let's see. Here's some songs on my Songs for the Revolution play. Steve Earle, The Revolution Starts Now. Firewater, a Little Revolution. That's the name of the song, A Little Revolution, by the band Firewater. They got a great video that was inspired by the Arab Spring a dozen years. Sing Me a Song, Sing a Song of Revolution by the Go Set. Start Now by Rancid. Take Back the Powers by the ska band, The Interrupters. Excellent band, excellent song. Let's see, The Workers' Song by Dropkick Murphys. This one's for the workers who toil night and day. Let's see, Gil Scott-Heron, anything by Gil Scott-Heron, really. The great, now let's see, The Interrupter, let's see. No Rest for the Wicked by Cage the Elephant. That's a very good song. Basic Income. Beverly Hills by Weezer. Broken World by The Interrupters. Salvation by Rancid. I've got on my personal website, I have a playlist called Songs for the Revolution. Very few of those are actually about basic income, but a lot of them are about progressive politics and so forth.
So with that playlist, that probably would not be approved by Milton Friedman. Let's see.
A lot of them know, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
So, you're welcome. Great talking to you, Ahmed. So it's also it's great. You really know American politics. Like a lot of Americans couldn't have asked me all these follow-up questions. I wouldn't have known the background to ask me all of these follow-up questions. So you really know American politics. But on the other hand, it's great to have Egyptians in BN because BN has been spreading to more and more countries, but there's a lot of countries where there's still not a lot of interest in basic income. And Egypt has been one of those countries. So getting Egyptians involved and getting the Egyptian North African perspective is really important. So I hope we talk later about the Egyptian perspective on basic income.
We definitely will, and then also like more from your perspective from Qatar, because that's much closer to Egyptian.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right, great talking to you, Ahmed.